full lecture on plants, uh, wherein we looked at how these plants had evolved and how even in plants you find adaptations which take them to be survivors in specific ecological conditions of various ecosystems. Now, when you do a biodiversity documentation, you know that there are components which are biotic components, and then there are abiotic components like climatic factors, temperature, soil, the food items with these individuals animals have. So all these also influence how these animals survive in that particular habitat or ecosystem. So I'm going to look at biodiversity documentation from that perspective of how the ecosystem has to be looked at from the point of your biodiversity document. Now, why this is important? When you do biodiversity documentation, you are actually documenting the biotic factors, you're documenting the abiotic factors, that means the climate, weather, and etc., the living part and also the non-living part, the factors, and also the human aspect of this ecosystem. Now, to do it properly and also to have an understanding of how much is each biodiversity component influencing the survival of that particular habitat or ecosystem, you need to understand the subtle relationship between these interactions. That is why biodiversity is not just about talking about the living and non-living things. It is also about the interactions that is happening between the living things and also between the living things and the non-living aspects. So we need to look at some very interesting subtle interactions that are happening, which also must get documented when you are looking at a habitat or an ecosystem. So my talk is going to look at that. So let's start. So the initial part would be trying to tell you about what are these subtle interactions, some very interesting interactions which are normally not talked about, looks like hidden. We may just see it now, and then I will end it with a documentation of one single habitat, and that's where I will end my talk. This talk, the first part of my this talk is going to be mainly about the subtle interactions. The second part would be applying this knowledge and also the knowledge that you acquired in the other two lectures, and then trying to see how different ecosystems can be documented in terms of their biodiversity component. So this is how my two lectures would be spaced out and would be looking at. So let's start today. Now, as I said again, we need to look at the biota or the biodiversity as animals, plants, that is a living part, interacting in the non-living part, and these interactions surviving in a maybe in a sustainable manner in some ecosystems, or may not be in a sustainable manner in some ecosystems, but they do sustain for a period of time that they are there. So that's what we are looking at. So when you look at this, and when you look at the earlier lectures that you have listened, you will understand that every organism, whether an animal or a plant, it's a bundle of adaptation. What do these adaptations do? Obviously, many of you know about it, but then when you put it into a kind of a picture, you get a much clearer understanding of what we are going to talk today. So these adaptations are mainly beneficial because we are putting a human connotations to this. So let's try to talk in that term only, that when you say adaptations are beneficial because that improves the survivability of that particular organism. So most of them are beneficial, some of them may not be. So most of which that are beneficial will maximize this organism's ability to utilize the resources of that ecosystem. So that's what makes that organism use the resources of that habitat much more efficiently, and therefore maximize the benefit that it can derive by utilizing those resources, by which it increases its own survivability. So this is what every organism does, and the final aim of this is survival of the organism, and therefore the adaptations most of them which are beneficial, ensure that there is a increased survivability. Now when you talk about survivability of that animal, we are not just talking about life and death, we are talking of something else. We are also talking about minimizing the interspecific competition. That means it is able to survive better because it can compete better with other species or other organisms that it is sharing the habitat with. So it's able to meet the challenges of this competition better. So that's one aspect of its survivability. Second aspect is that it has better reproductive success. Now, what do you mean by reproductive success? Is that it is able to rear its offspring survive to its survival level, and therefore leave behind the footprints of its own genetic information to the next generation. So that is what we know in biology as reproductive success. And then it increases the successful gene transfer to the next generation. This is finally the whole uh, you know objective of any species reproduction, that its population survives and sustains over a long period of generation, and that is possible only if individuals are able to transfer or part with their genetic information successively to the next generation through the offsprings. Now that would involve nesting, parental care, all those things, but all of them also come with some aspects of adaptations, both in form and both and also in behavior. So those things finally lead to that. Now what this entails to, now this leads to that when an individual gives its genes to the next generation more successfully, that individual genes then spreads in the population more successfully, and therefore there is more number of those genes, proportion of those genes surviving in the population increases, and therefore the number of such individuals, number proportion increases in the population of that habitat. Now you cannot allow this to go in a continuous manner. That means a population, an individual which is able to survive better will produce more offsprings, more of its proportion will increase in the next generation, and so on. So there, that would lead to a population boom of that particular species. But when then again, when the population size increases, there is a resource crunch. Now, this is the most important subtle interaction with the ecosystem. Resource availability is limited. So therefore, every ecosystem, every habitat, whether it is micro habitat or a macro habitat, has its own limitations of ability of sustaining a certain size of a population of every species. Moment that number increases, there is a challenge of getting resources, there is a challenge of meeting the competition, there is a challenge of diseases coming in, and therefore the population will come down. Most of the natural populations are never able to reach that level of that particular threshold where there is a maximum number of individuals in the to the level that a habitat can sustain. It never reaches there. Before that, there are other factors which bring down the population. So always you will find that in natural populations, the population number fluctuates in a wavy manner. It increases for some time and then goes down, again increases. There are very, very, very few populations which show a sustained plateau, or sustained number of population size over a period of time. Human beings are an exception because we have made ourselves to survive in every kind of habitat, every kind of environmental stress, and we reproduce in larger the number than what nature would have liked us to do. And therefore we are facing the problem of space crunch, of food scarcity. So there are sometimes diseases coming in and the number of individuals dying are more. The pandemic is a good example. Now this will happen. So this happens even in human population. So if you look at the entire picture which is seen on the screen now, you find that it is an organism and how it survives an ecosystem that makes the organism establish itself in terms of its species number as a population in any given habitat. So I'll give you a very classic example of a subtle interaction which I told you about the population. Parasites are a very interesting group of animals in every ecosystem. We hardly look at parasites. We look at the main animals or the host, to be very frankly. But the parasite population and their ecology is very, very interesting. And sometimes they have to be studied in more closer than what we do normally do, or even we don't even bother, but they are a very important part of the food chain, very important part of an ecosystem life cycle. Now the parasite ecology, if you look at, they're very interesting. One of the important thing is the parasite biomass is always less than that of the host. You will never find the number of parasite much more than I'm talking about the biomass, not the number. If you look at the bacteria, which is a parasite, its number obviously would be much more than the number of animals present in the habitat. But if you take the entire mass of that bacteria and look at the entire mass of the host species, obviously the host biomass will be much more than the parasite biomass. Another thing is that the parasite will not any time lead to the terminal loss of the host species. It never happens. The parasite will not devour the host to such an extent that the host is totally exterminated, because that will be detrimental to the parasite itself. Because parasites are a classic example of super adaptation to survive in a specific food part of that ecosystem. So it has specialized, it has super specialized. These adaptations are all, directed by genetic evolution in such a manner that it is completely now dependent on the host and the host lifestyle. So therefore extermination of the host will obviously exterminate the parasite also. So parasitic mode of survival will always see to it that the host population survive, so that the parasite also has continuous host availability. Okay, this is another important point. Now, many times we say that parasites evolved from some form of organism which were originally free living. It's not so. Now, with molecular evolution theories and understanding more of molecular evolution, we know that some parasites have not come out from free living forms. They have actually evolved as living forms by mutations, and they have then changed their lifestyle. So, this also can happen. Now, most of the parasites have a very complex life cycle. Now, in biology terms, we call it alternative generation, or they have a number of hosts, intermediate hosts, we call it. The final host can be one, but during its life cycle, it may have one or two hosts as intermediate host before it reaches the final host. Now, this is a very interesting adaptation for survival, so that if the final host is also exterminated, the parasite is still surviving in the intermediate host. It is not so very possible that all the hosts are exterminated unless there is a natural calamity where everybody dies. So that's an extermination of life of that ecosystem. So that can happen. But by life cycle behaviors, it is generally not allowed, and it is ensured that sustainability takes place in generations to generations. Now, this is a very good example of, very subtle relationship between parasite and the host. Now, there is this killfish. Okay, it's a American species. Now they found, some of these fish have a very weird behavior, that they come to the surface of the water more often than the other individuals of the same fish. Now, some of the fish biologists were intrigued about this behavior. They started looking at this fish little more in detail, and they found that this change in behavior is brought about by a parasitic infection. The parasite is so very nicely adapted its life cycle in such a manner that it infects the fish, and the young ones of this, or the larvae of the parasite, goes and settles in the brain of the fish. And then, because of its staying in the brain, certain areas of the brain, the behavior, the fish, the swimming behavior of the fish changes, and the fish goes up to the surface of the water more often than what it would never have done in its normal life cycle. Now, what happens with that is that they found that, those fish which are infected with the parasite, they go to the surface of the water almost 30% more than those fish which are not infected by this say parasite. The parasite is a trematode, which is a flatworm, something like it's called, a common name for it is a fluke, the liver fluke, for example. Now, why is this change in behavior brought about? Because the fish is surfacing more often than its other individuals, the fish which is infected with a parasite gets killed or gets picked up by the birds which are sitting in the same pond and trying to catch the fish, because this fish surfaces even if it doesn't want to surface. Because of his brain getting infected with the cyst of the parasite, the brain activity is changed and the fish is forced, its behavior is forced, that it comes up to the surface and gets caught by a heron or any other fish or any other bird for it. Now, what is the benefit to the parasite? The parasite's definitive host is the bird. So it now finally gets into the bird by changing the behavior of this intermediate host, that is the fish. So this is a very, very interesting interaction which is happening in the habitat. Now, why it is interesting? Because if there is an increased number of fish infection happening with this parasite, the fish getting eaten by the birds will also increase. That means the food supply to the birds will increase, and the birds getting infected also will increase. Now, this particular trematode has another intermediate host, that is the snail. Now, how does the parasite coming into the fish? Is through the snail. That means after the bird is eaten the fish, the parasite gets into the bird and it survives in its alimentary canal and it releases its eggs. The eggs fall down with the feces of the bird to the ground, to the grass, and then there that egg is eaten by the snails which feed on the grass or which crawl on the ground, and it gets into the snail, and in the snail it again the parasite young ones are produced which gets released into the water, and inside the water the parasite gets into the fish. Such a beautiful linkage of survival. Now, why this kind of interaction is very important for the biodiversity part is because the snail population usually increases with pollution. With oxygen reduction in the water, the snail populations increase because the snails survive in less oxygen water. And with increase in snails, this parasite will increase. And with that, more fish will be infected and more birds will be infected. So this particular cycle, so that means the infection of the parasite changes the food resources available in the ecosystem, and the birds get a little more than what they actually normally would be able to catch. Now, going ahead, the same kind of thing we can apply to coronavirus. Now, many of the microbiologists were talking about the coronavirus not becoming very serious after it has infected a huge part of the population, what we understand as a herd immunity. The same parasite ecology also works with viruses. And that is why in most of the countries where the parasite infection, I mean, the virus infection has increased to a certain extent, it has always come down. It had never killed the population like a straight line going up. It always goes to a peak and then comes down. It's a natural law for all. Sorry, I'll just have a glass of water. So, sorry. So what you find in the coronavirus case also is a simple application of parasitic ecology, and the number of cases has decreased. Even to some extent, in some places they have also found a virulency of the virus has also changed. Now of course there are mutations happening, which is also a case because the parasites increase in number very, I mean the viral parasites increase in number so much that the mutations make a lot of effect in their virulence. So that's a different biology altogether, but as far as parasitic ecology is concerned, it applies to them also. Now there is a very very interesting thing that is happening just now, as I explained. A very interesting example. There is this aquatic snail, Planormella tenuis, which is again found in North America. Then there is this parasite which is called the Sessions trematode, which is a flatworm, and it infects this snail. Now, what is interesting is that this particular trematode infects the tadpoles of frogs, and the frogs get these extra limbs growing on them. Initially, this was not understood at all. Especially in many of the North American rivers, they suddenly found that in some of the portions of the river, the frogs with deformed like extra number of legs were suddenly appearing in large numbers. During a survey, the scientists came to know this, and people initially thought it could be pesticide problem, it could be pollution that is causing all this. And then some biologists actually looked at these frogs in more closer inspection, and they found a very interesting correlation that they were all infected with a trematode in large numbers. Now, this infection in the population of these frogs were up to 30%. See, I still maintain the same thing that there is no heavy infestation. It's only a portion of the population that is always getting infected. Maximum what they found was up to 40. And that also, these parasitic infection changed. In some places, it went up to 40 and then it went down. And then some other part of the river got increased infection. So it shifted from one place to the other along the river banks and in some ponds. Now here again, the principle is the same. The parasite initially comes onto the ground. The final definitive host is a bird. Again, here herons, especially herons and egrets, these are the final definitive host. All waders are the final definitive host. That means these frogs with multiple limbs are unable to swim very efficiently, and therefore they get easily preyed upon by the birds. Now, this is an advantage for the parasite, and that's why it has caused this deformity. Actually, this deformity, I'll tell you about it happens, how it happens little later, but then you learn this, understand the subtlety of this relationship. Because of this deformity coming in the frogs, suddenly the food available of these frogs, amphibians to the birds, they also get infected in salamanders, in some frogs, and also in some toads. So it all happens there. So salamanders and frogs were the ones most commonly found to have infectations, and the birds feed on them. So the parasite therefore gets into the bird. There it produces the egg, comes out of the bird through its excreta, and then gets into the snail because the snail walks all over the grass. And then from the snail, it gets into the water and again comes back and attacks the tadpole of the frog. See, where the frog lifestyle, if you see, there is a stage where the tadpole is there, and the tadpole starts getting the hind limb. It is at that stage of development that the parasite gets into the tadpole. It's a very interesting thing that how the parasite is able to attack exactly that developing tadpole and gets into the tadpole and then causes havoc on its limb development, starts producing extra limb. The frog may survive to a size, and but still it may get eaten up very easily by the predator, and the parasite succeeds in going into the host by changing the development of one of its intermediate hosts. So this is a very interesting thing, very recently found out actually. The paper was in 2000 somewhere, where they actually got this kind of data, and now uh, this is the one that we know that how this thing is happening, that you have the snail, these are the eggs that get into the snail. From the snail it gets into the tadpole at this stage, and then the tadpole actually produces multiple limbed frog, which is eaten by the bird, and inside the bird again it produces the eggs which come back, and the life cycle is cleared. Now here what you find is a parasite has two intermediate hosts. One is the snail, the other is the tadpole or the frog, and then the definitive host, the end host, is the heron or the bird. So you can see this. Sometime the frogs have been found to grow to the full size, harrying the, but then their lifespan is reduced because they get predated very fast. Now, actually, there is some paper where they have found a similar kind of infestation in some frogs in Sri Lanka. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any paper which is talking about such kind of occurrences in India. But definitely, if it is happening in Sri Lanka, we also must have trematode species. There are a lot of trematode species which infect the frogs, and we must have seen such kind of things happening, and we wrongly attributed to pollution. Now, one more thing, pollution does have an influence, because they have found that some herbicides and some pesticides make the tadpoles more susceptible to the attack by the parasite. So that may increase the incidence of such multiple, legged tadpoles, and the availability of these tadpoles to the herons will increase and birds. So applying herbicides and pesticides can change the food availability cycle or the food cycle of a given habitat like a pond or a river very, very efficiently, because we have not understood the subtle relationship that is playing within the normal lifespan of these frog, birds, and the snail. So that is also there. But actual cause of the deformity is infestation of the parasite, which can be increased if the pesticides and herbicides are used. Now there is another thing. This is my own experience, that we had a problem that our we were growing some mosquito larvae for some experiments and studying, and we found that our mosquito larvae were getting killed, and they were not forming mosquito at all. I mean, we were not getting the last instar of mosquito. By the fourth instar, that instar is different stages of the larvae. At the fourth instar, all the mosquito larvae used to die, and we were surprised what is happening. And then when we studied, we found that the culprit is use of tap water or use of water from the overhead tank. And then we checked the tank water and we found the culprit. Now I'll show you what it is. Now the mosquito larvae has several instars like this. From the egg, it gives the first instar, second, third, and the fourth instar, and then you have the pupa. So we saw that all the larvae were dying at this fourth instar stage, but they were not becoming pupae, and we were not getting the adult mosquito. Now, what we did was we looked at the fourth instar stage. Fourth instar stage, as you know, the mosquito larvae actually hangs upside down from the surface to, because its tube for breathing is there, so it hangs upside down, and then the pupa comes. Now we found that all our culture, the we could get only the fourth instar and nothing beyond. Now we looked at these instars. We picked up these instar, fourth instar larvae, and looked at the microscope. what we found was their entire body, especially legs and abdomen, was all attached with a protozoan verticella. It's a ciliate protozoan, and they were all attaching to the body. Lots of them were live. You put it in tap water and observe under the microscope, we could see that all of them were live. Now, I'll show you an enlarged picture. This is how the verticella looks. It's a common freshwater protozoan which is found in pond water, and somehow through the municipal tap water, it had come into our tank, over a tank, and it was surviving there. And then we found that if that tank water was used to grow this larvae, the larvae were dying because this verticella was attaching to the larvae, and because of the larvae, the larvae getting attached with verticella, their movement of limbs were totally blocked because of the very thick culture of verticella attaching to their body. So they couldn't swim and come to the surface, and they were dying. And verticella was feeding because they always feed on this dead and decaying material, and that is how they survive. Now, so what you see from here is that mosquito larvae has a natural predator in the verticella, which is a ciliate protozoan. They are found in pure pond water. They are found everywhere. But when we use our herbicides and pesticides, and especially soap water going into the pond, these get killed, and that is where the mosquito larvae survives. So actually, by doing anthropomorphic, actions like washing of clothes, releasing of pesticides and herbicide, we are actually killing these parasites, which otherwise would have killed our harmful mosquito larvae. So one of the reasons that why anthropomorphic activities can influence an ecological lifestyle. Now, the same mosquito larvae, we again checked under microscope. There were lots of ciliates. These were tiny protozoans. As you can see the enlarged picture here, these are all tiny ciliates which actually eat the larvae, and infestation of these ciliates into the larvae kill them. And they are also common. They are free living ciliates found in pond water, fresh water, and they all get killed with addition of herbicides and pesticides. And that is how the natural enemies of some of these larvae get destroyed. So, what I want to tell you from these two examples is that see how intricate some of these food chains are, and we may not understand which are the aspects that are getting affected by our activities, pollution, for example, and we see only the final effect of these influences in terms of something happening in the trophic level. Some of the species are coming down, their behavior is changing, but actual cause is very deep rooted, and we must not have even bothered to see it when it actually started. So biodiversity documentation is therefore a very important exercise where even such minute subtleties are also properly documented. So what you find in the after this discussion is that we need to look at an ecosystem as a community, a habitat as a community, a forest as a community, dead wood decaying in the forest as a community, a pond as a community. Everywhere individuals are interacting, like how our housing colony is. We are a community in a housing colony. We have our neighbors, we have the entire people who are living with us, and then we have people who service us, and then we also have people who help us. All of us are living together, interacting with each other, and we are sustaining our lifestyle. So that is our community kind of a lifestyle, which is also the way every habitat and ecosystems function. We also have to understand that for these interactions and survival needs of resources, animals have adaptations. And then finally, Because of all these interactions and successful interactions, successful utilization of resources which are enabled by adaptation, the animals become reproductively fit and therefore give to the next generation their genetic information that could be passed successfully. So this is all the end result of an ecosystem interaction, which is also an integral part of biodiversity documentation. Now let's look at how species influence resource in an ecosystem. For example, let's make a graph of the resource available on the x-axis and its utilization by species on the y-axis. So when you look at it, it is like a bell-shaped curve because this is one species. For example, it will utilize one particular type of resources much more than the other. So therefore, there is a focus on certain type of resources. For example, a bird which is eating seeds will focus on seeds, but at times it would also feed on some leaves. It may also feed on some other material, some insects also. So, though resources, if you see, but its main food may be the seed. So, so we'll have that all species are adapted to use certain kind of resource from the habitat, and in that utilization, certain type of resources would be preferred much more than the other. This is a normal tendency. It is always like this for any of the species. Now, suppose if there are additional species coming in, trying to utilize the same resource base, what will happen? So now what happens is two new species that has come, they are now using the same resource. So there is a overlap, there is competition. But you cannot continuously sustain the same population with the same kind of competition because the bell shape will not remain the shape. So what will happen is the species now try to reduce the interaction by changing the focus on little bit of the side resources, not in the center resources, which their initial focus was. Now they try to look at some other resources. So what will happen is the the height of the bell goes down, but now the base spreads. So there is very less overlap between the resource utilization of the species. So competition is reduced. Now, this will continue for a long period of time, but still, this is also not a sustainable picture because there is overlapping areas. The species would like to reduce their interaction with other species, so the less competition. So now they try to focus more and more into much less overlapping resources, and they would try to separate out. Their focus now shifts, and the three species will try to now specialize into three different resources. Finally, they get specialized, and hardly there is any competition. So if I go back, this is how the species get established. So initially it was resource one species, then same resource three different species interacting. So they try to specialize into side resources or fringe resources, we call it. Not the main resource. Maybe one of the species which is very, very well adapted will continue to use the main resource. Other two species may try to look at the fringe resource. Still, they will try to reduce the competition by getting more and more specialized to fringe resources. And finally, they three become totally different. So one would be using the main resource, other two will be using the fringe resources, and there is hardly any competition. This is what you see in the waders on a seashore. The shape of the beak and the length of the feet, length of the beak decide to what depth they can go on feeding. So there is hardly any competition. So this is the kind of graph you will find if you draw it for a, and it is similar for forest, similar for a pond or any kind of ecosystem. The species generally try to reduce the overlaps between the resource utilization. Now, if suppose there is a huge diversity of resources, that resources are plenty abundantly available, there are a lot of different species. This happens in an island. especially in an island, where there is the resource is the space is limited, less of species variety, and resources are plenty. So then all of them will get equal number of food. There is hardly any much of competition. There is overlap, yes, but each of them is getting a certain similar amount of resource utilization abilities to survive in the habitat. So this would be the graph. So there are about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 species surviving on the same habitat, each one trying to reduce the overlap with the other species. But yes, competition is there. Wherever the overlap happens, it will definitely lead to competition, but still sustainability is ensured. If suppose there is resource is very less, for example in a pond or on a seashore, large number of species are looking at the same focus resource availability, this would be the type of interaction you will find, that all of them will cram extremely high level of interspecific competition. That means between species there will be huge amount of competition, but they all will be able to sustain if there is no increase in population of one species or increase in availability of one resource. So this is what will happen. There is a high ecological overlap in such kind of places. All of them are trying to remain at the same place, and generally you will find the species those are found in such areas generally have similar kind of adaptations. You can use this as an example in birds on a seashore. Again, same kind of thing you will find. Species specialization. Resources there, but all species are specialized. So you will find each species as a focus resource, and that is the maximum that it will use, though there is a very little bit of overlap. Now, this happens in a forest. For example, there is competition between tiger, the leopard, and the wild dog. And you will find all three of them, if you study their food preferences, you will find the tiger, the leopard, though they have overlaps, all three of them tend to eat one type of prey much more than the other. And there is a beautiful paper by Ullas Karan sir who has studied this, and they have shown how does a forest sustain wild dog, leopard, and the tiger on the same prey basis. Then you will find tiger prefers to take a bigger size of prey, leopard little smaller, dole would try to take very smaller prey, but sometime pick up the bigger prey, but that frequency is very very low. So each of them, though they are living in the same type of forest, they reduce the competition. They reduce the, though there is resource overlap, utilization overlap, the competition is reduced by changing their way of hunting and changing the way of their prey selection. So this happens unknowingly, but it definitely happens. And the animals tend to sustain their lifestyles much easily by reducing this competition. Now, if you look at this graph, what it is say talking is about competitions, because as I was talking about competition, generally when there are specialist animals, when there is more of interspecific competition, interspecific means between species, when there is huge amount of competition for resources, there is a tendency for species to evolve and become highly specialized. So over a period of time, you will find that from a generalist species, you will find a more optimally adapted species evolving, so that it reduces the competition and resource is utilization is maximum. Pangolins are very good example of specialized, specialists who have got adapted to one type of food sources or one type of resource base, and very very absolutely no other marginal resources are being used. So this is a very good example. Similarly, if there is more of intraspecific competition, that means within the species there are more number of individuals, less of resources, and there is a increased competition within the species or the individuals of the same species, then preferably the individuals will become more generalist, so they would prefer to broaden their habitat use. So from the initial focused use of a resource, they will now try to come to the marginal resource base and try to spread out. So this is a very interesting. Then, like for example, grazing animal will try now to browse more. So this is a very good example that how initially they were focusing on grazing species, but now they changed to browsing. So they try to take leaves as an additional resource. Now this happens when there is a huge competition, and it happens in many forests, especially in the dry season when the grass is limited in supply. Individual grass availability is limited, and also the available areas are limited, so all the grazing species try to congregate there, and that leads to competition increasing between individuals. There is competition of the same species, and therefore some of the individuals then go to the forest side and start browsing as an additional resource. So animals which have very high competition from individuals of the same species, the evolutionary approach of these animals tend to be becoming more generalist. Whereas if the competition is from individuals of different species, the evolution of adaptations tend towards becoming specialists. So this is a very interesting thing, and that is happening in all ecosystems. So this also is due to interaction between individuals. Now, very good example of this kind of speciation or evolution are the studies on finches of Galapagos archipelago. Now, Galapagos is an island, a group of islands, archipelago in fact, which was close to Ecuador in the Pacific Ocean. Now, it became famous because of Darwin's, visit to that island and his book on origin of species. Now, he studies evolution there and brought out his theory. Now, we have done, currently biologists have done lot of studies of molecular ecology of these finches, and we understand much better about this evolution than what Darwin could write in his book. Now, let's look at what actually happened. Now, this is the Galapagos Island, the group of large number of islands there, and this is the finch that originally was in the mainland, and it migrated to the island. That is how the finch first came into the island. This was millions of years ago. Now I'll tell you the time frame also. Now what happens today is that the finch that migrated to that Galapagos Island about 2 million years ago, it encountered a island habitat with lots of resources, and therefore it could sustain. And because it was an island, predators were not there, so it was free to survive there. So those birds which migrated to that Galapagos Island in those 2 million years ago found a paradise of resources, and they started sustaining themselves. Their populations increased, they started breeding successfully, and then slowly the mutations started occurring due to interaction between individuals, competition for resources, and that slowly led to genetic mutations leading to natural selection. And then what we have fun very interesting is that common ancestor gave rise to the ground finches, tree finches, and the wobbler finches. Now all of them vary from each other. Today we have about 14 15 species of these finches in Galapagos. All of them have evolved from that single ancestor, which obviously might have migrated to that Galapagos Island. All of them differ from each other mainly because of their beak shape and the beak size. Because of this, the food availability, the food that these finches can eat can change. So again, I go back to my slide where I showed you that whenever there is a competition between species, specialization start occurring. But this here, initially the competition was between individuals of the same species, then they got into generalized behavior, and then slowly there was competition between these two different species, and then they started specializing to different food sources. So both interspecific and intraspecific competitions resulted in this kind of selection pressure on the beak type, and therefore adaptations to feed on one type of food. Now the question is, how did this happen? We are looking at a time frame of a very short period. If you look at evolution, 2 million years is a very short period, and this happened. How could this happen? What was the reason? So today we have genetic analysis of DNA analysis of all these types of finches available, and biologists have come out with good explanation to this. Now they found that just about 1 million years back, the tree finch, the ancestor of the tree finch, that is the red line, and the wobbler finch, they mated. Probably they mated because then you can find that there is a combination of these genes coming into the next generation. Now, this is 1 million years. So you can see the ancestor coming and this hybridization occurring is just about a million years of time. After 1 million years, within 1 million years, this entire variety of finches evolved in the Galapagos Island. Now that's a quite fast pace of evolution. So we are looking at these 15 species that must have come just about 1 million years back. Now, what you find is that the common ancestor gave rise to the ground finch, then the cactus finch, and then you have the wobbler finch. These are the three main types. You can see this has very, very thick bill, this has intermediate bill, and this has very, very pointy bill. So the wobbler finch feeds on very small food items, whereas the ground finch has to break thick seeds which has fallen ground, and therefore it has got thick bill. Now, what you find in all these differences is the shape of the bill and the size of the bill. Now, today we know due to molecular biology studies that this can happen very easily with one set of genes which is coded as ALX1. Now, this ALX1 gene mainly it's a common gene found in almost all groups of vertebrate animals, right from the reptiles, birds, and human being also this gene is there. So it's a common gene, and a little bit twisting or mutations or changes happening in this bill, in this gene, can change the shape of the bill and the size of the bill. So changing the shape and size of the bill was nothing so very impossible. It was quite plausible because changes in genes can always happen. So individuals with different bill varieties can have easily evolved from that common ancestral finch. Even in human being, the bill, actually this bill codes for the proteins which trigger the development of the shape of the tip of your snout, especially the nose and the bills in case of birds. In human beings, actually, it actually causes, if this gene is mutated, our nose and mouth area get disfigured. So many children are born with this nose disfigurement due to a mutation in this ALX1 gene. So you can be sure that this gene is the one that actually triggers this change in the bill shape. So now you can see in a habitat, evolution can happen just by the change in genes. So this is what is explained by the Darwin's finches, that when a competition and resource trigger adaptations of various types to come into the population, and then you get more and more individuals which are different from the original stock of population, and then you get new species evolving. So this is very important, that some of the differences in individuals and species also get documented in biological biodiversity documentation. I'll come little more. The question that we need to understand is it all evolution or this always directed towards adaptation, that it makes the animal survival better, it makes the animal the most fittest, what we call as the fittest animal survive better? Is it always the end result of evolution, or always evolution acts as if there is a direction towards the entire process? We have always looked at Archaeopteryx, the ancestor of birds, as the first animal to produce feather and then fly. We never thought that the evolution of feather was always for flight, and that's how the birds evolved. So we thought that evolution is always directional. Evolution happens due to random changes. There is no direction. Direction is brought because those individuals carrying those changes survive better, and therefore their individuals also carry those differences, and those differences increase in proportion in the population, which is a very, very random process. Sometimes it get died in its course also. It may not get established. So there have been cases where these adaptations have not got established in the population. It may get established, and if it establishes and the species survives better, it is good for the species. So the question is, are all adaptations results of natural selection? There's a very good explanation by the Stephen Jay Gould, a very, very, very coveted biologist. He is an evolutionary psychologist. He explained evolution. He always doubted this explanation that adaptations come because of natural selection. All adaptations are leading to natural selection, the good ones, I mean, and therefore evolution has some direction. He always refuted this. He said, no, we cannot always look at adapted. So he called this particular view as adaptanistic approach to evolution. He said that is wrong. Why should always the feather evolved because for flying itself? No, it could have evolved primarily for insulation. That is what is there. What is the proof shows? Feathers evolved in reptiles, some ancestor reptile, for insulation to control the heat exchange. But it gave rise to a benefit of flight. So you cannot say that in evolution, feather appeared for flight in birds. No, it is not. So he says it is an X adaptation. I'll explain to you. He takes this example of spandrels. Spandrels are when you try to put a dome on a square structure, you get these gaps, which are called spandrels. Now, most of the Roman churches, you will find these spandrels are there. This is an architectural loss of space. In fact, that space is absolutely have to be formed. You cannot do anything. That space is always there when you fit a dome over a square structure, a flat structure. But in Rome churches, that particular blank space they used for making paintings. So most of the spandrels in churches are with very good paintings. Now, if you look at the painting, then we will think that the spandrels have been formed to put paintings, which is how you are looking at the feather evolution. The evolution of feather led to flight in birds. So he's saying if you look at the spandrels from painting's point of view, you are making a wrong judgment. You should say the spandrels were part of an architectural process, and it came, but its secondary use was to exhibit the paintings on the spandrel areas. So he says that feathers came for insulation. The evolution of feathers was primarily for insulation. Flight was an X adaptation. So he says many adaptations that you see in habitats are actually X adaptations. So what he's saying is that animals have adaptations coming in them due to changes in their mutations of the genes, and those adaptations are always there, and therefore you may get a future adaptation because some adaptations are already there. So what he's saying is that the feather which came in the ancestor reptile was for insulation. Because it was already there, individuals started extending the limbs, and the feathers went into the limbs, and probably that is how we got flight, which was a secondary adaptation of the feather. So it's not that always evolution will lead to adaptation. Adaptation will always lead to survivability. Many adaptations have no effect on the survivability of the individual, and those are what are called the neutral adaptations, which is called as the neutral theory of evolution. So we need to also look at this way. I'm telling these things because you need to look at the organism from a different angle to understand its role in the biodiversity and in the ecosystem. So when you document, especially lesser animals, their role in the ecosystem is very, very important, and documenting them is very important. So therefore we say census of tiger is very important, but census of mongoose in the forest is equally important. That's the one of the important thing. Now here is an example of X adaptation. This was a paper which was by Strauss and his team in eLife, which is in 220. It's the latest paper. What they did was a very interesting experiment. They kept a human subject and put four speakers around them, around that person's head. And they gave some sounds and they recorded the neuronal activity of the muscles which are there around the ears. I'll tell you this. Oh, sorry. Now we have lot of muscles around the ears, but we cannot move our external pinna of the ear like other, like cows, dogs and cats. We cannot move the ear pinna. Some people can move the ear pinna very slightly, most of us cannot. Now am I audible, madam?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Yes, yes, you are
Okay,
audible, Shashi.
okay.
Yeah.
Now these muscles on our ear pinna are absolutely not needed because we are not using them, but we still have them. They're all developed, and there are neurons also, there are nerves going into it. So this is an X adaptation. We have lost this use of these muscles around 25 million years ago. If you look at the human evolution, the use of ear muscles were lost about 25 million years ago. Today we cannot use. But there are individuals who still can twitch their ears, what we call it the wriggling of the ear. Some of them can do, some of them can move the external ear also. I am sure some of your friends may be able to do it. So we lost is about 25 million. But then what you find is that if you have a parent, a mother for example, who can wriggle the ear, and if you have a father who cannot wriggle a ear, the child, many of their children will be able to wriggle the ear. If both the parents can wriggle the ear, some of the children can wriggle the ear, some cannot wriggle the ear. So basically the inheritance of this wriggling ability of the ear is not very clear. So we think that it is not due to single gene, it must be due to several genes which is causing it. Now, but we definitely cannot do like this. We definitely cannot do like this. Now, so our ability to wriggle the ear is partly. So what they did was they did a very good experiment, and I'll go here, and they found, if you place these tiny electrodes on the ear pinna and on the around the ear, and try to see whether there is any neuronal activity happening. So that's what they were testing. So they kept the subject in front of these four speakers, and when they gave sound from the back speakers, they recorded the electrical activity of the muscles of the ear. And then also when they gave sound from the front speakers, they recorded the electrical activity coming from the neural muscles, and they found that there are activities. Now this individual was unable to wriggle the ear, but the muscles were active. What does this indicate? That we all have ability to activate the neuronal muscles, but those muscles are unable to trigger the bending of the ear pinna. So in a way, what biologists are saying that we have an X adaptation still remaining with us to change the direction of the pinna. Maybe after several hundreds of generation, it may happen that the number of people who can wriggle the ear may increase, and we may be able to slightly directionally take the sounds. I mean, this is just a hypothesis, but this is a very classic example of X adaptation, that we have this ability already in us. We need to only expand it to move our ear pinna. It can happen over several hundred year generations. It can happen. It's possible. The possibility, though we lost that movement of ear 25 million years ago, the muscles are still developed, nerves are still developed as in the normal case. So this is a very interesting thing about X adaptation. Now here is another good example that if you all study this bacteria in our laboratories, you know, when these E. coli are grown in the laboratory, usually when you put this bacteria in the medium which is having their food, the bacteria generally take some time to adjust to the medium. So that is what is called the lag time. And after the lag time, they start reproducing and exponentially grow them in number. So their sudden increase in population increases take place, but then they flattens out because the availability of resources is limited in your flask. I mean, this is happening when you are adding a specific amount of food, but you add more food, more the bacteria will grow. So I am considering that the food is limited. Now the bacteria population is increasing, but it has reached a stage where no further increase in bacteria is possible because food availability is limited. And then after a period of time, the population will die. So if you don't add more food, the entire bacterial colony will die. Now, what is very interesting is that if you keep this bacteria like this, the bacteria will die. But if you take this bacteria further and try to grow them with little food after some time, you will find from this dead colony again some bacteria start growing and they give certain population. So which means that there were few bacteria which have some genes which got triggered and then they could survive. And that gene has been isolated, and we have this error prone polymerases which start changing the genetic expression. And these genes are triggered when the bacteria is put to starvation. Now, this is a very good adaptation many of these bacteria have, that when they are put into starvation, that is when their resources crunch is very severe, they get triggered with some genes in them. And some of those individuals who have these genes triggered, they survive and they form into a cyst. And then, moment the food availability is there, these animals can still produce a colony. So such kind of adaptations are also there in microorganisms. Okay. Now here is a good example that how genetics can give rise to different species behavior. Now here is an example of old field mouse and the deer mouse. Now both of them have a different type of burrow. The old field mouse has a burrow which has an entrance and also an escape tunnel. So the escape tunnel is just kept below the ground with no opening. So the moment the mouse is threatened from its entrance tunnel by some predator, it just escapes by breaking the mud wall and runs away through the escape tunnel. Whereas the deer mouse has only one nest area and it doesn't have an extension which goes as a escape tunnel. So there are two distinct type of burrowing behavior of these mouse. Now what we can do is we can breed these two together. So because they can interbreed, the old field mouse and the deer mouse, both of them can interbreed. So what you do here, if you do this interbreeding, the old field mouse or the deer mouse, for example, here, which does not produce an escape tunnel, they produce escape tunnel. So here is a classic example that whenever there is a interbreeding, some genes from one species can get into the other species and can produce totally different behavior in that hybrid. And that also can lead to new species appearing in a habitat. So this is a classic example of how interbreeding between closely related species can lead to formation of new species in an ecosystem. So evolution can easily occur because of just transfer of few genes from one species to the other. Now here is another example that, many times when birds are given, predators are around, it is very seen that the predator presence prevents the parents from feeding the young. So here is an experiment where, the parent birds were shown through a speaker calls of predator birds, and they found that moment these speakers were switched on, the parent birds never fed the young ones. The frequency of their feeding totally went down. So this can happen even in our ecosystem. So the number of predators change the behavior of smaller birds, especially the prey species, even in their parental care. So this is another influence. These are very subtle changes that is happening in the population, and therefore, if they are not able to feed, sometimes the survivability of the young ones will be affected. So you may lose some of these young ones, which otherwise could have survived in case of the predator pressure was less. So this is another example. Here now, this is in the birds. Now look at this in wasp and your, wasp and your fruit flies. Now, fruit flies are flies which lay the eggs in decaying vegetable matter, like fruits, for example. So they lay the eggs, and in the decaying or in the fruit, they lay the eggs, and the larvae feed on the fruits, and that's how the fly's life cycle is completed. Now they have found that there are wasps which actually pick up the larvae and take away, and kill these larvae, and they feed on them. So there are wasps which attack these larvae of these flies, and therefore their survivability is reduced. Now what is seen is that whenever the wasp population is more, when the wasps are predating more, these fruit flies, they lay eggs in more decaying fruits, not in fresh fruits or just decaying foods, the fruit which are more decayed. Now what happens is, in more decayed food, alcohol presentation is more, alcohol content is more, and this alcohol content, the smell of alcohol, prevents the wasp from coming onto that fruit. So this is a very interesting behavior change that the fruit fly changes, the fruit fly females bring about to reduce the predation by wasp on their young ones. So they change their behavior by laying eggs on more rotten fruits, so that their alcohol content prevents the wasp from visiting those fruits. Now, even in these flies, you can see such subtle change in behavior happens due to some abiotic factors changing in their habitat. So this is another interesting aspect of interaction of species. Now, this is a very, I'm just to break the boredom, I try to bring this particular example in human beings. We all have sweat, and all our sweat, individual sweat, have different smell. Now, it's very interesting that this sweat smell is also due to a protein which is called as the MHC, major histocompatibility complex. Now, this particular protein is the one that changes the mate choice in human females. Can you believe it? I'll tell you what is this experiment. Now, these major histocompatibility complex is one of the major factor for our immune response. So each of us have different immunity because of the changes in the major histocompatibility complex protein. So this protein is the one that decides what is your level of immunity. Now, whatever is been found is that there are about 15 to 20 different types of gene expression that happens in human beings, and each one of that causes difference in immunity. Now, the greater is the immunity, better is the individual survivability in the nature. This is a very good, obvious, profitable thing for a human being. Now, what they have found is that the sweat of people who have higher, different level of MHC has different smell, and it has been found that people, especially ladies, they like certain sweat smells better than the other sweat smells. And they found that those sweat smells which the ladies like are the good genes which give better immunity. So here is a very good, interesting example of mate selection due to type of smell of sweat. And this is also true in many mammals, where smell is a major factor in selection of mate. In fact, this particular study, MHC factor is being used by some perfume manufacturers. So now you know special perfumes for men, special perfumes for females are actually based on scientific theories about preferences of smell by ladies, preferences of smell by men. And one of the reason is of the sweat component, which reflects the type of MHC that we carry, which also reflects the type of immunity we have. Now, one aspect which is final thing that I need to talk to you about in ecosystem in biodiversity documentation is succession. In every ecosystem there is a tendency for succession to occur. Now, succession is change of a certain component in an ecosystem to a different level of that ecosystem. For example, a soil, plain soil, can change into a forest after several million years or 100 years. Chola forest is the ultimate level of succession. Solar forests of Western Ghats are the climax forests. They are termed climax forests because they have reached the final stage of succession. And that beyond that, nothing can change. So if you destroy solar forest, you are actually bringing back the succession to which has happened millions of years now to zero. So what is succession? One simple good example is a primary succession from bare rock getting changed into soil, because the bare rock first gets covered by lichens. Lichens growing on them produces chemicals which dissolve the rock surfaces and break them down. Now because they get broken down, they becomes little subtle and little bit of gaps appear, and therefore the mosses then come in. So now the mosses can take root. From the mosses, then little bit of bigger lower forms of plants can join. And then finally, because these plants grow into them, their roots go into the rock get completely broken down and the soil is formed. This soil then grows other grasses, then small shrubs, then small trees, bigger trees, and finally a climax community or a forest. So beyond this, nothing happens. So if you destroy a climax forest, it is back to the soil. Now, please remember the top soil that is formed in a tropical forest, they have estimated 1 inch of top soil takes about 100 years to form. So when you are allowing the top soil to wash away in rainwater, you can imagine how much of natural processes are being destroyed. So this is one thing. Now, this is primary succession because right from soil to it becomes forest. So a pond is there. A pond, if it is allowed to just remain like that, you will find slowly from all the sides the plants will come in. Slowly the plants will overcome, and if the water depth is not so much, the pond will totally disappear and it will become a small forest. This is the succession. So succession is continuously taking place in all ecosystems. But in certain ecosystems, habitats, for example, in a reserve, in a wildlife reserve, these successions should not be allowed to take place. Then human interference has to come in. That is what we call as management of wild habitats. I'll come to that little later at the end of this talk. Now, here is a secondary succession because fire is a good example. Fire will destroy whatever is there. So the system goes back to the first stage of succession, and then you get again a process of succession taking place. The area that was denuded by the fire gets transformed into its original forest, but takes time. But this is a good exercise that is always considered. If it is done in a controlled manner, it improves the resource availability, resource regeneration in many of the ecosystems. So forest fire many times are useful as long as it is happening only in a in a controlled manner. In a less if it is intense fire, then everything is lost. Then we cannot have we will have to wait for thousands of years for that place to come back. Now here is a good example. This is an example from Kanha National Park of India. Now Kanha National Park had about 8 to 12 villages inside the core area of that tiger reserve. When it was declared tiger reserve, they displaced all these villages to the buffer areas of the national park. So the core area was denuded of all villages. Now these villages were having farmlands, they were having houses of thatched wood, simple natural materials were being used. And when they were totally removed, that land became barren. The succession took over and the land became covered with grasslands. And all these areas, some of them had ponds, village ponds that extended, that survived. And then there were water areas built up in some of those farmlands, and animals came there to start drinking water. The surrounding areas became beautiful, lush green grazing areas. So we had lot of grazing animals coming to that place. Now the forest department realized that this is a very good thing, because the more number of grazing species coming in, more would be the predators attracted to that area, and it becomes more interesting for visitors to see. So they went into a very nice planning of preserving these grasslands. And today, Kana has these grasslands which are actually man made grasslands. Because the villages were shifted, there was barren land which changed due to succession into grasslands. Today, what we are doing is we are not allowing the grasslands to succeed into the next level of succession of forest. So we are keeping, by management techniques, we are keeping these grasslands as grasslands. So what they are doing now is that these anthropogenic grasslands are arrested at the stage of ecological succession. So we are preventing the succession to take over. So actually what they are doing is they are actually removing the sal forest which is surrounding these grasslands. These grasslands today, their seeds fall into the grasslands, small saplings of stalks come in, immediately they remove. So every year they have an exercise of removing all the trees which have started rooting in the grasslands. Similarly, they remove the weeds, so the grassland is maintained. Then they also do fencing of certain regions of the grassland so that the herbivores don't overgraze. So part of that grassland is fenced, part is kept open. When the fenced area is opened, the unfenced area is then closed, so they go this alternatively, so to change the availability of grass. Then they do soil management, they do water management, and then they do fire protection of this grassland. So, and some areas they do controlled fires so that a secondary succession is allowed to take place. So here is a interference of human management principles to keep the habitat in a rich fashion, resource rich, so that more number of individual species can be sustained. So actually what we are doing is we are changing the carrying capacity of the habitat by management techniques. Another important aspect of biodiversity conservation. So one of the reasons that they could do this is that hard ground Barasinga of Kana National Park, which had reduced to almost 50 animals in the 70s, early 70s, have now risen to 700 in 2015. It's almost 800 now in the last census. So this is a beautiful recovery story of a very, very almost extinct species back to recovery due to these conservation measures. So what I mean is when you look at biodiversity documentation, you also have to look at the conservation measures, conservation aspect. And conservation doesn't mean that human interference should not be there. protection and human interference both have to be done to really sustain a certain habitat if needed. Now, here is a classic example of biodiversity documentation from Pune University. This paper is available, Kulkarni et al., Journal of Threatened Taxa of 2015. It's open source journal. So you all can see this paper. Now, what they did was they documented species biodiversity in a pond. I'm talking about a single ecosystem as the last part of my talk, just 2 minutes more. Now, this pond is a temporary pond. It's a very interesting thing. Many times we look at lakes, rivers, and say are a beautiful ecosystem. But we never understand that even temporary ponds have got beautiful biodiversity. Temporary ponds are those ponds which dry up in certain months of the year, and again in monsoon they fill up, and then again the biodiversity comes back. Now, it was a similar kind of a pond, actually a quarry in University of Pune, which was excavated in 1864, and it dries up in the summer months as the picture on top shows, but in monsoon it fills up with a luxurious biodiversity. So they studied this pond for almost 5 years between 2009 and 2014, documented the biodiversity, a very nice paper they have published. They got about 125 species of aquatic fauna, 25 species of associated fauna, and some groups of protozoa, diptera, nymphs of odonata, that means dragonflies, which they couldn't identify, and about 7 taxa of vertebrates and invertebrates, 83 arthropod species, rotifers, about 45 species. That's a freshwater small, you can call them as plankton, microorganism, single celled animals. Then Coleoptera, that is beetles, were one of the major group of animals they found in this pond. And they also found some endemic species in this temporary pond. That's the most important thing, that even temporary ponds have such beautiful biodiversity. I will just give you some slides of their finding. These were the aquatic plants that they found there. These were the rotifers that they found in the water. All microorganisms, they can be considered as microplanktons. Then freshwater sponges, a very, very interesting group of animals to be located. We hardly see these in our forest ponds, or rather people don't even bother to look at them. They may not even understand, even if they see it, that these are freshwater sponges. Then thermocyclops, which are the first record in Pune that they found in this pond. Then freshwater snail. Then you have ostracods, which are crustaceans, small planktonic crustaceans, a group of crustaceans which remain floating in the pond water. These are also seen there. Then they found dragonflies, the freshwater beetles, so many of them. Then they found freshwater bugs, which they have recorded. Then spiders, some specific species of spiders near the pond area, frogs and toads, which they recorded there. And then one of the frog, which is the ornamented pygmy frog, they found thriving in that temporary pond. Now, this ornamented pygmy form is important because this frog actually got almost extinct in the western region of Maharashtra, because the government introduced the mosquito fish to kill the mosquito larvae. And the mosquito fish started feeding on the tadpole of this frog. And it became such a huge conservation issue that almost the entire population of this frog was being threatened because of huge release of this gambusia, or the mosquito fish, which started feeding on the tadpole instead of the mosquito larvae. This is another thing that we need to understand, that when we interfere, sometimes we don't understand the subtleties of the interactions which are naturally occurring, and we interfere there, causing problem for some species. Then they had birds. Oh, sorry. Oh, I'm sorry, that slide is not. They had birds like kingfishers, egrets, and other herons. Then they also measured the physical parameters of the pond, and you find that the oxygen level goes down to very low, especially in dry months. And you will find the flooding time of the pond is from late June to March. Whereas the drying up is from March to end of April, the pond is dry. That means April, May, June, almost 3 months, there is nothing in the pond. It is dry. And in spite of that, so many microorganisms, so many plant species, they survive in the dry months in whatever survival techniques that they have, in seed form, in cyst form, in whatever form, and they all thrive back as soon as the pond is inundation happens during the monsoon. So you find it that even a temporary pond. Now we say that Thana district is having lot of ponds. How many of us really looked at the pond from the biodiversity documentation point of view? And they are very rich biodiversity hotspots actually, which help in the other biodiversity cycles to continue in rest of the places. Okay, so I stop here and then we can have continuation of it in the next time. So I'm ready for questions.